Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Journey podcast. I'm your host, Mashroor, and today's episode is very special. Given the current circumstances of the Black Lives Matter movement and protest, I thought it was necessary to have a conversation with someone who has expertise in the field of anti-racist rhetoric. And so I invited one of my professors from the University of Waterloo to come have a conversation with me about systematic racism and injustices against black people and people of color in both the American and Canadian context. So today I am joined by Dr. Frankie Condon. Dr. C is an associate professor of English at the University of Waterloo. Her primary areas of interest lie in the fields of rhetoric and writing studies. More specifically, she is interested in the intersections between critical race, labor, and rhetoric studies, in narrative and performativity, and in critical pedagogy. Dr. C is also the author of Performing Anti-Racist Pedagogy in Rhetoric, Writing, and Communication. I Hope I Join the Band, Narrative, Affiliation, and Anti-Racist Rhetoric, and the Everyday Writing Center, a community of practice. So since she has spent her life learning about anti-racist rhetoric, I thought it would be necessary for her to come on and have a conversation given the current circumstances. In this episode, we briefly touch upon the history of systematic racism, the current Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd, the impact of racism and colonization in the Canadian context, and steps we all need to take for a more just future for all. So I hope you learned something from this podcast. I know I learned a lot, and it is really exciting to have an academic talk about these issues. Hi, Dr. C. Thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Hi, thank you. I'm so glad to be here. It's great to see you.
Yeah, you as well. It seems like the entire world has flipped upside down since we last spoke back in fall 2019.
Yes, it does. Yeah. Although, it seems as if it's flipped upside down, but one of the things I've been thinking about over the last couple of weeks is that this has happened over and over and over again.
Right.
Whether we think about Ferguson or Staten Island or Florida, or we think about, lynchings in the 19th century. Lynching has been a fact of in the lives of people of color, for a long, long time.
Yeah, I think for sure that when it almost felt like something was cooking, and this was kind of like the tipping point of something that needed to happen, in the sense that, like you said, these protests have been cyclical and have been getting major. In class we discussed a lot about the lynchings, and we discussed a lot about the entire civil rights movement. And to me, this seems like, with the access of information through the internet, this seems like a kind of like uh, continuation of that work, if you will. And to me, it was very painful, because last night I was going through some of our notes from our class, from our the class that I took with you, the course on dissent, and I was reading Fannie Lou Hamer's work.
Yeah.
And she said this one quote, we're tired of waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And that same sentiment is the same thing that you see now. So then you think about the last 60 years, and you think about what has happened in the past, or 50 years or so. And then you look at the progress, and then you look at how much has changed during that period of time. And then you realize, okay, so the black people, the issues that they had during like 50 years ago are the same issues, lynchings that are still happening now, police brutality that's still happening now. We saw in the riots how people were like being hosed down, beaten, peaceful protesters during the civil rights movement. So we're seeing the exact same thing occur now 50 years later. So what has changed, right?
Oh, you're asking me what's changed?
Right.
Well, I think it would be a mistake to not acknowledge the extraordinary sacrifices and contributions of so many civil rights activists.
Mm-hmm.
over so many years. I think that there were certain legal protections or certain legal protections for white supremacy and for racism that were in fact successfully dismantled.
Right, right. True. There has been some progress in that sense.
There, I think another piece of progress is the sustaining and ongoing depth of conversation and cooperation among and between peoples of color and white accomplices about racism and white supremacy. So many scholars of color have helped students like you understand what racism is, what white supremacy is, how these forces are in operation in all of our lives, how we collude with these forces, and what we can do to resist.
Right.
So I do think there has been progress. I think W.E.B. Du Bois said one time, he was a great sociologist. I can't remember if we talked about him in class or not, but so W.E.B. Du Bois said at one point that Americans, and I think we could extend this to Canadians as well, love to think of a problem as solved before they've actually done anything about it. So when faced with a complex problem, he says, we'll announce that we've fixed everything when in fact we haven't, right? And so I do think there is this tendency when something happens to say, we did this thing and it's all fixed, but we haven't addressed it in all of its complexity and wickedness, right?
Right, 100%. I think that is very true. And the progress shouldn't, the dismantling, like you mentioned, of like these white supremacy groups shouldn't be discounted. And at the end of the day, I think social media has played a huge role in this movement, just because I feel like now more than ever, we have so much access to information, and things are being passed around on Reddit and on Twitter, where people can truly see these videos and be affected by it. Like, so for example, that is all part of the education that we're talking about. Like you said, we were very prior to the social media, or like even while we had social media, we kind of became, I mean, by we I mean myself, kind of became complicit to the rules. And you kind of take everything for face value and believe in, like, oh, this is how things are supposed to be, or whatever the rhetoric may be in that case. But then you have institutions like the universities where you can actually go in. And I really wanted to say this on record, is that the first time I truly got to think about these issues was in your class, because I felt like before that point, the education system kind of sheltered me towards a different rhetoric of that was, I guess, less truthful, in the sense that it was washed over. It wasn't as raw and honest as it could have been. And maybe that's part of the problem as well, where the system kind of educates their people in that line, rather than the honest, I guess just like the actual historical things that have taken place.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad if I have been of help in some way to your growing understanding and recognition of these issues. I mean, I guess the thing I think about social media and the proliferation of images and videos is that this is a kind of a double-edged sword.
Right.
In the sense that certainly videos like the one we saw of George Floyd's murder give truth value
Mm-hmm.
to the testimony of people of color about their experience of racist violence in ways that make it much harder to dispute or to deny, right?
Right, right.
But on the other hand, I will confess to feeling both some rage and some despair when I ask myself the question, how many Black people have to die at the hands of the police before white people acknowledge the reality, the material reality and lived experience of white supremacy and racism over and against people of color?
Mm-hmm.
I think that, yes, we learn from such a moment, and the 8.5+ minutes of George Floyd being murdered might facilitate our learning, but at what cost?
Mm-hmm. I know.
That video wounds people.
Yeah, yeah. I think. Yeah. Just when I first saw that, it's just heartbreaking when you see something like that. And the thing is, like, we've been, at least from my personal experience, I remember hearing about Trayvon Martin when I was in grade 9, and that must have been 8, 9 years ago now, that it took place. And that was my first kind of exposure towards, and I grew up in a very, I guess, ethnic community where I was surrounded by brown people, Black people, and mostly it was a low income neighborhood. So I kind of understood, and I kind of sided with the the rhetoric that I heard from people there. And we experienced racism as well in our low income neighborhoods, and so I was aware of that. I was aware of racism, but to the extent of, now it almost seems like it's not now, but, like, now it's apparent. But the tyrannical abuse of police power, right? The brutality that is taking place at this point, no one seems to be policing the police, and clearly the system is not okay, where we are seeing so many people of color and Black people being murdered, and it's also being documented, and the police officers are walking away free from these from their actions.
Yes, I think that's true. I'm thinking a whole wash of things at once. So let's try and sort out what I think. I think it's a funny thing that, not funny haha, but funny, interesting in a troubling sort of way, that so often when police brutality becomes a visible and tangible issue again, we expect the police to police themselves.
Right.
We expect that they will be capable of that. And clearly they will not. They never will be. And it isn't, simply the police, right? It is ridiculous to ask anybody within any problematic or racist institution who has an investment in maintaining that institution as it is,
Right.
to institute change. It simply won't be done. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to say is that I think that the state has multiple means or apparatuses by which to enforce white supremacy and racism. Some of those apparatuses are repressive, like the police or the military, say, and some of those apparatuses are ideological, like the university.
Right.
Say, right?
Right.
So, and these apparatuses, both repressive and ideological, work in concert with one another. They're interdependent on one another, right? So the police can do what they do in a certain kind of way, right? With the, a foundation of ideological justification and legitimation, because people like you only encounter education about racism and white supremacy and civil rights, say, in one class in your university.
True. Yeah. Yeah, that is 100% true. I think systematic racism. We talked a lot about this as well in class. Like for example, things like redlining,
Right.
right? Like I always remember Dr. Cornel West when he talked about, you ask people to like pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but they don't even have the bootstraps to pull themselves up by, right? So there's a clear disparity there in the sense that they're not given the equal opportunity to thrive in life, right? In these situations and in society. And
Well, I've always thought, sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah,
I
no,
always
no,
thought
please go ahead.
that saying is ridiculous, right?
Right.
So its origins are in naming the impossible.
Right.
Pair of boots on and try and lift yourself up by pulling on your bootstraps. Nobody can do it. Nobody ever does it. Nobody ever has done it because it's impossible, right? But the saying has morphed over time
Right.
to suggest that people who succeed and thrive have achieved success because of their hard work, not because of any legacy of privilege.
Right. Or any
That
form of
has been an active
intersectionality that might
work,
have like
right?
acted on them.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And even that idea of intersectionality, I mean, I'm jumping all over the place now, but even that idea of intersectionality was very novel to my scheme of the world, I guess. You know what I mean? Like the idea of seeing how different and maybe that's a fault of my own, probably is, and not, maybe it's a fault of the system as well that I was being educated under. The idea that the your the circumstances of your birth, things that are completely out of your control, that you had like no control over, ultimately determine your life course. And and it showed me how much of my life, how much learning I still had left to do, in the situation, because it made me realize like you cannot well, the main thing it made me realize is like every single person's life experience is going to be different, and you cannot equate any one person to the other.
Well, I mean, here are the things that I would say about that. So, one thing is that the social and political and economic arrangements that uh, shape our lives they didn't appear magically.
Right.
They are the products of human agency, of human design and human construction and human participation, right? And
Right.
that's the good news, because what we have made, we can dismantle. They're not ontological facts. They're not necessary to our existence,
Right.
right? Although they do sometimes get represented that way. Yeah. And within those social and political and economic arrangements, individual people, of course, have different kinds and qualities of experiences, but there are patterns in those experiences that we need to recognize and acknowledge, because they are a means by which we can perceive the consequences of arrangements that seem natural to us, right?
Right.
And so I think it's not exactly right to say everybody's experience is absolutely or fundamentally different from everybody else's. There are things that are uniquely ours, experienced by us in unique ways because of, I am the daughter of Suzanne Van Meter. I am the youngest child of my parents. I am the place where I grew up. There are things that are uniquely Frankie, but there are patterns of experience that accrue to me by virtue of my white skin, by virtue of my class background, by virtue of a history of ideas about what constitutes civilization and who's civilized, that reach far beyond or far further into the past than my birth.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So these systems that are in place, that they have been, it almost feels like it has been, these systems have been ingrained, or these patterns of thought that you mentioned, are they have been ingrained in our daily lives, and we kind of become complicit to these ideas and accept them for their face value.
Well, so Charles Mills, who's I think a great philosopher of color, calls this epistemological ignorance, right?
Right,
And so
right.
he says that uh, this will be a little bit fast and reductive, but essentially what he's saying is that the rules of racial order require white people to remain ignorant about their own privilege, about the ways in which advantages are conferred upon them by design, by the institutions that they have created precisely to produce that privilege.
Right, right, right.
Uh, to um, to remain ignorant to the ways in which that privilege and those notions of white supremacy shape the lives of people of color in violent ways. And so I think one of the conclusions one might draw from Mill's insights about epistemological ignorance is that some part of the work for all of us, but particularly for white people, is to push back, to work willfully and deliberately and deliberatively to become less ignorant.
For sure.
Ignorant, not in the sense of, fundamentally stupid, although sometimes I do feel like we are, but in the sense of uneducated.
Right. And I think now more than ever, and I'm feeling this a lot now in like my friend circles, where there is a spark of conversation surrounding these ideas, and sometimes, like I think it almost feels like things had to line up in this manner, like the pandemic happening, and they kind of forced people to stay home, and they got, they finally left their cyclical, hamster wheel that they were on constantly. And then it's a very individual thing where you're constantly just thinking about work, school, whatever, you have, so we all of us have so much on our plates at all times, right? So whenever you hear about these different murders that occur due to police brutality of like Black people and people of color, and these injustices that occur, the hashtag exists for like a couple of days on Twitter, and then it goes through the cycle, and then we kind of sickly normalize this, the actions that take place, right? And I feel like, in my opinion, due to the pandemic, now that we kind of got some time to step back and be more introspective about the systems that are in place, and even individually ourselves, to have a look at ourselves. I feel like the murder of George Floyd was kind of like a tipping point, in the sense that people put their foot down, saying no more, because now that they're not distracted by the work that they had to do for for a living or whatever it may be, they can kind of put in more time to educate themselves and be part of the conversation, rather than kind of like scrolling through it, right? And accepting it for what it is. And I feel like, in a way, that to me personally was like, this event to me personally was one of those events that I'll remember for the rest of my life, I guess, because it kind of shifted things into gear, where now we're having open conversations about it. Like, one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you on this podcast is because I felt like, in my power, and I emailed you before about this, that while these things were occurring, I felt very powerless, in the sense that it's very overwhelming for a person like me. And I kept feeling like um, I didn't have enough to give, I guess, or enough to do, or I couldn't make a difference, kind of. That was my mindset. But I felt like it was important for me to at least the least I can do is educate other people and myself mostly. Like I'm learning, through this conversation. So so yeah, like I truly felt like this time, like whatever is taking place had to take place in this manner, and I'm excited that young people, like a lot of my friends, went out to protest in Kitchener, Waterloo, you
Mhm.
know, missed. And I think one of my friends actually said you were there as well.
Yes, I was. And
So to me, it seems like the conversation, like right now, even on social media, I believe people are not posting things that are not relevant to the conversation. I've stopped posting podcasts that are not relevant. Like I thought this was the first one that I'm going to post on social media, because right now the conversation needs to be directed where it is, and it is making change. The protests are, like they're gearing themselves towards a better outcome than it was before, right? Rather than ignoring it.
yeah, I do think, and I may have said this in class or not, I certainly think it often. I thought it at the march
Mm-hmm.
the other day in Kitchener Waterloo, um, that the greatest hope, I think, that I can see in such a moment is the awakening of conscience among young people.
Right.
I think those of us who are baby boomers or have arrived comfortably at middle age have demonstrated our inability and unwillingness to change ourselves or the world
Mm-hmm.
in which we have come up. So that so many young people are coming out and speaking up, aligning across racial lines in solidarity with one another in service of dismantling racism and white supremacy, I think, is the most hopeful sign that I can imagine. I worry, though, I'm a worrier. And I worry because, for a couple of reasons. One reason is that we have seen people protest before.
Right.
We've seen people come out onto the streets before.
Mm-hmm.
And the agitation dies down. Somebody says they're going to do an investigation.
Right.
And people think, okay, well, somebody's taking care of it, then we're done. And they move on to other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they arrive suddenly at something that's been going on for a long time. And as soon as they feel like they can justifiably absolve themselves of responsibility for doing anything about it, they're off to the next thing.
Right.
And for me, that's not okay.
Right.
It's appalling. I go back to, you remember in class, we watched a video of Cornel West.
Yes.
And he says, what needs to die in you in order to love?
Right. Like burning it off.
Right. What needs to die in you in order to live justly and to serve the cause of racial justice, right? The other day, someone whose work I very much admire posted on Facebook. She said that a lot of white people are coming to her and asking her, what can I do? How can I help? And, some part of her post is about, why are you asking me? Why don't you take responsibility for educating yourself? But the other part of her post, it says to her white friends and colleagues, if you aren't willing to lay it all on the line, if you aren't willing to put your career at risk, your friendships at risk, your familial relations at risk, everything you know and care about at risk in service of doing this work, then you're not ready.
Mm-hmm.
You're not an ally. Essentially, I think posing the same kind of challenge that Cornel West did. What needs to die in you in order to keep on?
Right.
Accepting and acting on the responsibility to create change, right? And so in some way, I'm still watching. Uh, I'm hopeful,
Mhm.
uh, but I'm not convinced.
Right, right. I think from my own personal experience, it has been, and maybe because there's like, most of the people that I follow on social media, and most of the people that I'm friends with are around, like, they're between like 18 to like 30, for example, right? So within that age group, I find a lot of people now, like, especially on Instagram and Twitter and wherever, like, they are not letting the conversation die in any way, shape or form. There's different levels of discourse that is going on, and there's different levels of personal and collective dissent that is taking place online, through, like, whether it be the peaceful marches that are taking place, in Canada and in the United States, whether it be just sharing a post online that is donating money to the movement, to the foundations that will help the situation, or whether it be just having like open conversations. Like, one cool thing that came out of this is the fact that it shed light to the injustices in the Canadian context as well, because we brought it home and we kind of looked at it and we looked like, hey, it's not all, it's not all rainbows and butterflies south of the border, north of the border. So it kind of, like, brought into attention to a lot of these issues that we talked about in class, and that's because I decided to take your course. But in everyday conversation, these topics were not coming up, right? But
Yeah,
now, due to the circumstances, people are not letting these ideas die down, on social media platforms. And for that, I'm really, I guess I'm more optimistic about it, because it's the first time in my life that I've witnessed something like this. And because, in the past, whenever there's a story of brutality or injustice, it kind of dies down, like you said. People feel like they've done enough, and they kind of, like, goes in, like, for example, one of the main issues that we've been talking about among my friends that are also brown is that there is a certain rhetoric of anti-blackness within South Asian communities as well, that exists, right? So, for example, even you know they sell beauty products to, like, whiten your skin, because that
yeah,
is the most ideal skin to have, and you're judged based on that. So, we're just having conversations about, like, how we need to sit down with our families as well. And even though, we understand that, I'm an immigrant. My parents immigrated here when I was a kid, and they clearly, they haven't been exposed to different, diverse cultures, growing up. So to them, like, to undo, and it kind of goes back to what you said, like, how much are you willing to put on the line, right? So for them to undo all that conditioning throughout the years and to learn something new, that is like a death of the ego, right? So we've been having these conversations, in the sense that, like, we've been talking about, like, how we can bring that into our families and start from our own houses, and see, like, let's diminish it here at this level to what we have control over. And then, it kind of expands, like it has, it catches on like wildfire. And to me personally, this is the first time that I'm seeing actual, dissent like that, actual people taking personal responsibility and action, and collectively having these difficult conversations,
yeah,
and a lot of that was fueled by anger. A lot of that was fueled by, just like people being empathetic towards, like, I was thinking about it the other day. I'm like, this is 2020. We're in 2020, and the lynchings that we saw in class were from the, I forget the dates, but they were around like 50s and 60s, if I believe, if I
yeah,
remember correctly. Excuse me. And to me, to see that same thing repeat itself at 2020, like that, I I couldn't, that. And I saw this video on Twitter about, it was a man who's 45 years old, and a man who was, 31 years old, and another young man who was 16 years old. And the 45-year-old man was saying, how long will we wait? I've been dealing with this my entire life. And he was talking about, going at it with, I guess, with full force, because he was very angry about the situation, and rightfully so. This is rightful anger. Let's not take away anything from that. But I felt like, right now, watching those videos and like with the access of social media, people are really trying to change. Even, at least personally, I'm trying to change to be a better person, and uh, everyone is, not everyone, but like most people that I'm surrounded by are doing their part. They're keeping the conversation alive. So I'm really happy to see that. It feels like we're doing something meaningful, at least at the end of it.
Yeah, I'm so uh, happy to hear about those conversations that you're having with your friends. And I do think that uh, that this is one of the most important things that must continue to happen, is the will, the determination, the drive to across racial lines,
Mm-hmm.
to disconnect from the logics of white supremacy and its appeals,
Mm-hmm.
and to uh, affiliate with one another, to build relationships with one another, and to begin to think and speak and act in concert with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Singly, our impact can be significant, I think, in the locations where we are, in the close web of affiliative relationships that we exist within. But collectively, our engagement can have a much broader reach. So that, I think, is a terrific sign of hope. And I would want you and people who listen to the podcast to press back against that sense of powerlessness. It
Mm-hmm.
is true that we are contending with the weight and of historical racism and white supremacy that has had centuries to accrue heft,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and that saturates our lives in ways that uh, can quite reasonably make us feel helpless, right? Um, but I think we can do important work, even in the face of that terrible, devastating history,
Mm-hmm.
in ourselves, to undo our own ignorance, to enlarge our spirits, uh, to become more knowledgeable. We can do work with one another from where we are, and that work counts. But
Mm-hmm.
here's the other thing, and I know we did talk about this in class, but it bears saying again, I think, that uh, it isn't just that we want social problems to be resolved, and so we pronounce that they are. We want the ways in which those problems manifest in us to
Mm-hmm.
be resolved as well. So we expect that we arrive at a place where we can assert our innocence
Right.
and our absolute 100% success at not being part of the problem anymore.
Right.
And
Right.
that
Right.
expectation, I think, is unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Derek Bell, who's one of the great critical race theorists, talks about the permanence of racism. We cannot unthink a thing
Right.
by fiat.
Right.
We
Right.
can't undo a thing by fiat. Um, so I think that part of feeling powerful and enabled should be not the possibility that we'll be done and somehow arrive at a place where we can get the Purdue stamp of approval for being non-racist,
Mm-hmm.
right? It should be an acceptance of the reality that to do this work really is to commit to a lifetime of doing it.
Right. Right. Right.
That there are some failures that are learningful, and
Mm-hmm.
those are the failures that we should be uh, not trying, we shouldn't be trying to fail, but we should be recognizing when we do fail that failure is not a cause for leaving the cause. If
Right.
we can learn from it, it can push us further into the cause, help us to do better, right? The
Right.
only devastating failure is the one from which we refuse to learn.
Right, right. And I 100% agree with that. And that, I mean, there's a lot of people that are, they're scared of, taking action, or they're scared to to lose friends, I guess, to, like you said before, like to put, or family members, they might get angry if you post certain things. And you know, people that are, they're scared to be wrong, I guess, as well, right? And the thing that I'm learning now is that, look, as long as you're willing to accept that you're wrong and move on with it and learn from the situation, like you said, it is a life course of learning. It just doesn't end today. It just doesn't end with the hashtag dies. It just doesn't end like, oh, I'm resolved now,
Yeah.
I'm absolved of my sins. But it is something that, like, once I realized that, there was, like, for example, in our class, when we saw those videos of just like the civil rights movements, and also like the videos of indigenous sovereignty, and how colonial expansion kind of destroyed the way of life of these people. It brought me back to, like, my grandma, who was born in British India, for example, right? And then she kind of spoke of the same things, and then I connected the dots, and I was like, wow, like, there's certain things that I didn't know, and now I, like, my old ideas died, they burnt off, and then now I have a better understanding. And maybe the goal is to get closer and closer and closer to the ideal, right? Like, aiming up to that ideal, and getting closer and closer to becoming more and more knowledgeable and educated, such that you can take action that has, like, for example, engaging in conversations, for example, marching, so such that you can have, like, productive discourse.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm thinking as you're speaking about the fear of making mistakes. And what you're saying makes me think about the degree to which all of us yearn for innocence in some way.
Right,
And we
right.
act on that yearning in a number of different ways, right?
Mm,
One of those ways is I want so much to be innocent that I don't want to be wrong. So I don't want to say anything out loud
right,
because then I might not be innocent anymore, as if to be silent would somehow preserve my innocence, right?
right.
But another thing that I've seen in this moment, but also lots of times before, right, is the this kind of what I think is a sense that righteous indignation confers innocence.
Hmm. Right, right.
So, if I get really, really mad and I articulate my anger
Hmm.
loudly,
Hmm.
if I berate other people
Right.
for their complicity and their guilt, for white people, I will somehow become a better sort of white person, right?
Right, right. Then you become the token white person that.
Right. Right.
Right,
I'm a good white person and you're a horrible white person,
right.
right? But the problem with that is, of course, that to try and be a better sort of white person preserves the category of whiteness, right?
Right, right, right. Then you're
Uh,
still part of
right.
that
So if you
level.
think about, what needs to die in you,
Mm,
for white people, I think what needs to die in us is our ongoing attachment to being white,
mm-hmm.
right? That's really hard for white people to take on. Yeah.
Right, right, yeah.
Um, I don't think that I can, nor do I want to speak for or about the experiences of peoples of color in this regard, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do hear um, in what you've said, for example, about your grandmother,
Right.
speaking to her experience of colonialism and imperialism, and you're making the connection between that lived experience and the experience of Indigenous peoples in Canada, um, as a kind of a one of those extraordinary moments where in some way you are able to, by hearing her story, let go of your attachment to living safely and comfortably and innocently
Right,
within the
right,
colonial state,
right, yeah.
right?
And being very complicit with these ideas that have been kind of put forth and, conditioned, you know, like unless and until you look at the truth, I guess. And it's kind of like exposure therapy where you have to like look at it, and then the more you get exposed to it, the more you can kind of fight those anxieties that you have, and like
Right,
the conflict that you have internally. And in order to resolve that, like for me, that was just the connecting, the injustices against indigenous populations in Canada, and like how, like the cultural genocide that took place here, and connecting that to the same, to my own cultural and ethnic roots, and seeing those similar patterns kind of play out, and I'm not equating the two, obviously, but I'm just saying like the lived experiences of my grandma, and then comparing that to the lived experiences of people that we studied in class, and
right,
then I'm connecting the dots, and I'm seeing the similarities, and I'm seeing like, wow, like, it is easy to stay in your bubble, and it's very comfortable to not seek out information and be okay with what you know to be true and move on with it, right? It is way more difficult to dive into the history and to dive into the lived experiences of other people, you know that opposes your initial view, or that opposes like your way, like that's kind of like a death, because you're thinking like, whoa, like I was wrong. Like this is not how things were. I was lied to. So, but taking that responsibility, I feel, for like young people, it is a scary thing to do. And I think old people as well, like every I shouldn't discriminate against age, but I'm just speaking from personal experience.
yeah,
But for everyone to kind of accept that it is a difficult place to be, and I don't know what other people can, because sometimes you'll have conversation, and we've talked about this in class, how like, are we actually having conversation, or am I responding to myself? You know what I mean? Like, am I,
yeah,
do I have an agenda that I want to, so regardless of what you say, it's not going in,
right,
you know?
right.
So,
Yeah, while you're talking, I'm thinking of the thing I'm going to say next, right?
right, right, right,
Really hard thing not to do. We're so steeped in that practice.
right,
Yeah, that learning how to listen deeply and well is really challenging.
right, right.
Yeah,
To listen, yeah, to listen, and to kind of, to understand. Like, one thing I'm understanding now is the fact that I will never completely understand the Black experience, because I'm not Black, right? Because I cannot, I can try to be empathetic. I will try my best to put myself in their shoes, but at the end of the day, it will never be like, I'll never understand that experience 100%, right? But what a lot of people are doing now on the internet, which is amazing, I think, is that they're checking up on their Black friends, right? For example, they're talking to them. We're opening up conversation, like understanding, like, where are you? What are you thinking during this time? How is this affecting you? Because we know that it is affecting a certain population more than others, right?
right,
So it's
right,
it's important, I think, to actually open your ears up and listen, not, because at the end of the day, I think, if you're the type of person like, I mean, we all fall victim to this anyway, right? Like, where we have our own ideas that, that we are manifesting into the world. But if you don't get that input in, it becomes very your judgment can become very clouded, and that's where we get situations where people are, um they feel like they're speaking for a certain group of people, right?
right, right. This is so important, I think, what you're saying, to think about, to acknowledge, and to, contend with, right? Of course, you, uh, we cannot know from the inside the experience of others,
Mm-hmm.
right? Particularly the experiences of those who are racialized differently than we are.
Right.
Um, when we are willing and able to still our inner voices and listen deeply to peoples who are racialized differently than we are, to hear their stories, their testimony, and their witness, and to believe that we can be changed by it. And that is not to say that suddenly we can see their experience from the inside, but that our own perspectival horizon shifts and enlarges, right? And that means that we can be of better service to the cause of racial justice.
Right, and I think every single person has a part to play in that narrative, right? In the sense that the more you listen to these different people and their experiences, and then there's different outlets now that you can use. Someone might say, like, they don't have access to a person who's experiencing this, for example, right? But at the end of the day, we have all these outlets now, thanks to the internet, where we can, if you want to watch a documentary on it, you can. If you want to listen to a podcast on it, there's enough information for it to last like a lifetime. So I think to say that, to be in that rhetoric of like, oh, like I haven't had exposure to this, I don't know what this is about, right? Like, at the end of the day, if every single person is adding to the totality of knowledge that exists, and adding to the totality of like you said, the fight back, right? And then if you're all parts of the system, if you're all little components of the system, and it's a large organism, we can then propagate change just by taking on that responsibility, and seeking that information, and kind of educating ourselves in that line.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I smile a little bit in hearing you talk about, people's feeling that they're, that they're not exposed to this. And this is a thing that I hear quite often from white people. For example, that one of the pieces of my work is consulting with colleges and universities that are contending with racism.
Right, the anti-racist rhetoric.
Right. And so oftentimes, well, not surprisingly, when I am asked to go to such a place with my co-trainer, Dr. Vershawn Young, the places that we're being asked to go are predominantly white institutions, right?
Right. That's what's educating us.
Right. So one of the forms, or one of the things that we'll often hear is, we don't have a problem with racism here because there are hardly any people of color here. Right? Well, there are so many problems with that at some level I can't even. But but one of the problems is that, of course, if you live in a racial enclave,
right,
particularly if you're white,
right,
maybe you should ask yourself why people of color don't want to live anywhere near you.
Right? Yeah.
Or study in your classrooms,
right,
or attend your university. Maybe that would be a good question to ask, right? And maybe you might also then ask, what am I doing to change that?
Right, yeah.
So that's one thing. But of course, the underneath of that, we don't have a problem with racism here because there are no people of color here, is the assumption that racism is a problem that's caused by the presence of people of color.
Right, and
not racism and white supremacy of white people. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
So maybe another question to ask in such a circumstance is, what am I changing inside myself so that I am a person who's ready for deep affiliative relationships across racial lines?
Right. Now that is a very important question to ask oneself, because at the end of it, you could kind of live your life with that rhetoric, like, oh, there's no, like, if you're in, I don't know, if you're in a small town in Manitoba or whatever, and then you're like, oh, I never get exposed to people of color, therefore I'm not a racist, right? Because
I have arranged my life carefully so that I will never come in contact
Right.
with a person of color. So therefore, I'm not a racist.
Racist, right? So that kind of thinking really needs to die, because at the end of it, I believe 20% of the Canadian population is composed of immigrants. If I'm correct, I hope I'm correct. I don't.
I don't know what the number is, but
All right.
a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then, you know, even if you leave people of color out of it, just look at the people that got colonized here, right? Like the indigenous folk that are just being marginalized at every level. And to say that, to not acknowledge that is wrong. Is to say that, oh, like, there's no racism here. Like, clearly this country was built upon certain principles that are not, that were not inclusive, right?
Yes. Right. So Canada is not free of the historical legacies of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and since the early 19th century, people of color and Black Canadians in particular have been overrepresented in the criminal justice system, as have Indigenous peoples, and that continues to be true, right? I was reading a book by Barrington Walker the other day about Black Canadians in the Ontario criminal justice system, and one of the things that he says in the introduction to that book, I think, is that the history of the Canadian criminal justice system with regard to Black Canadians in particular is that, on the one hand, Black Canadians were in the 19th century and continue to be given, as they are in the US, longer sentences for the same kinds of crimes, or harsher punishments for the same kinds of crimes. In Canada, he says, he's talking about the 19th century, and he says that there were times when Canadian courts would offer a kind of paternalistic, noblesse oblige kind of moderated sentence. And that the animating force behind that paternalism was the demonstration of the superiority of the British justice system.
Right.
With the U.S.
compared to the U.S.
system, right?
Yeah.
I have been thinking about this so much since I read that book about, when Canadians want to assert that, particularly with regard to race matters, we are not as bad as the U.S., as if to be not as bad would somehow make us innocent or not culpable.
Right.
There's kind of deep-seated insecurity underneath that. Yeah?
Yeah, for sure.
And that is an obstacle to sustained systemic and institutional change, to national change, as it is an obstacle to individual and community change.
Right. If you don't acknowledge it, then you completely dismiss that idea, right? Because you're saying that, up north, it's all great. So those are the issues that we do not have to worry about, because we're comparing ourselves to our neighbors down south. So I think that it's like, in order for these things to change, we have to acknowledge like the disparities and like the injustices that do exist. I was reading the statistic that 3% of the Canadian population is Indigenous, where 30% of all people that are in prison are Indigenous. So there's clearly an overrepresentation, in that system. And like, you see it a lot. A lot of the rhetoric here in Alberta, where I am, where there's people that are, they, just the system really didn't serve them, right? The last residential school closed in 1996 here. And that's very recent. I was born in 97, so that's 24 years old now, right? So we're seeing the echoes of that, in our societies, and we are completely dismissing the past, and saying like, oh, these people are like this, etc., and kind of bubbling everyone in that same category, I guess, to kind of simplify our lives, because it's easy to group people like that and not think about the atrocious actions that have taken place prior, and to kind of be deluded to the idea that we live in this safe haven, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think that, under the heading of trying to pretend like we've solved a problem before we've addressed it in all of its complexity and wickedness, this is a really important, a critical example for Canada and settler Canadians. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
The notion that to dismantle the residential schools or to dismantle the practice of placing Indigenous children in white foster care homes or for adoption in white families
Mm-hmm.
is sufficient is to remain ignorant of or to purposefully ignore the devastating historical consequences of
Right.
those practices over time. We have not solved the problem of residential schools
Mm-hmm.
or the kidnapping of Indigenous children until we make reparations,
Right.
until
Right.
we make good what we damaged,
Mm-hmm.
right? We will never be done
Right.
until we give restitution and make reparations.
Right. Right.
And so there will never be reconciliation
Mm-hmm.
until that real material work is done. And what Canada has done, I think that the US has also done, is rather than acknowledging and contending with the necessity of making reparations and restitution for racial injustice and racial violence, to pour a whole lot of money
Mm-hmm.
into policing
Right. Right. Yeah.
those bodies of color,
Right.
right? And when we see the damage we have done enacted by individuals, we just throw them in the slammer, because then we can take away the signs of our own moral turpitude
And justice
and
system, right?
institution,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It's
A
a
terrible thing.
horrible thing to be in. Yeah. I think for sure with kind of connecting that to the police brutality that we're seeing right now take place, with people being shot with um rubber bullets or tear gas, or being arrested, and for peaceful protests. And I'm like I'm obviously not there, but from what I'm seeing from the internet, a lot of these these images are horrific. I saw this one reporter that lost her eye because she got
Yeah.
shot at with a rubber bullet. And rubber bullets, you're not supposed to shoot at the person. It's a non-lethal form. You're supposed to shoot on the ground. And then I'm feeling a lot of anger towards, like, authority, I guess, in the sense that a lot of anger towards, like, the policing that is taking place. Because in my head, I'm seeing, like, when I see something like that, it almost seems to me like something, Canada or the United States would say, like, it seems like a scene that would happen in, like, quote unquote a developing country, right? Like something you would see overseas, like in, like when we saw the scenes that I'm seeing now in
Yeah.
America. I'm comparing that to the scenes that we saw in, like, Egypt or Libya, like 8 years ago, for example, right? So for me to see that and to be a part of it, right? Because when you're seeing things overseas, people look at it and they're like, oh, this doesn't affect my life, and you move on with your life, right? But now I'm seeing it for the first time, and maybe because I'm conscious enough to understand it now, as an adult, and I'm looking at it, and I can't believe it, Dr. C. I'm seeing people, the brutality that I'm seeing. It's not, I don't see how it's justified or in what way it's justified, and that really makes me really angry and overwhelmed with emotion, because at the end of the day, like, I'm seeing people that are speaking their truth, right? And they're being faced by, overly protected, people. Like, the police officers are equipped and they look like they're like Master Chief from Halo. They're just like extremely, violent, and seeing those scenes being captured, you know it is truly heartbreaking, and it makes you wonder about how much of our taxpayer money is going to arm these people to kind of have that, to abuse their power, I guess. And what
Yeah.
needs to be done.
I hear you. I I hear you naming your sense of anger and outrage at the brutality of the exercise of authority
Hmm.
um, during the protests. Um, it is really troubling. I mean, I'm thinking about a couple of things. So, one thing is that I think in 1967, Martin Luther King gave a couple of speeches in which, and there had been uh, uprisings
Hmm.
in urban communities of color over that year and the previous year. And what Dr. King said is that um, the the riot um, is the uh, is the voice,
Of the
the
unheard.
speaking voice of people who feel like they have not been heard, who have
Right,
not
right,
in fact been heard, right?
right, right.
A few months after he gave those couple of speeches, a man whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, who was the chairman of the FCC in the US, kind of followed that line of thinking in an article in Variety magazine, of all places, in which he said that the American media was complicit in the silencing of, um, or in the failure of white America to hear. Uh,
Hmm.
that was the enabling condition for those uprisings.
Right.
Um, the other thing I think about with regard to this is that um, in many instances, I think, more probably than we are privy to, given the current media coverage,
Hmm.
um, if when people are unarmed uh, and marching down the street toward them is a phalanx of people
Hmm.
with shields and billy clubs and guns. um, you're asking a lot if you expect people not to defend themselves
Right,
when
right,
they are attacked,
right,
right?
right, right.
um, and I think you can produce violence
Hmm.
by starting the fight.
Right, right.
Right? um, I get so frustrated, um, honestly, like both from the media coverage and sometimes from the demonstration organizers as well,
Hmm.
who are saying, uh, the march in Kitchener-Waterloo that brought out, 10,000 demonstrators was peaceful.
Hmm.
Well, really, what did you expect? Do you think
Right, right.
people are irrational? Do you think that what is it that you expect exactly, right?
Right,
And
right.
how is your uh, uh, expectation that people of color in particular are somehow so irrational and uncontrollably violent that
Hmm.
any demonstration they might organize on, in order to be heard is going to be violent? So you have to say it's peaceful just to make sure. Do you know what I mean?
Right, right, right. It's kind of creating that narrative so that
Right.
it moves on with that. And I think an important thing too is also then from what I've seen from the videos that have been exposed online is that peaceful protesters that are Black Lives Matter protesters are calling out the looters and the people that are causing destruction, right? So like I've seen videos where they hand them over saying like like we are not part of this is not our
Right.
message, right? Our message is
Right.
peaceful protest. Now obviously you'll have malintended, I guess, opportunist people that are breaking down these small businesses or whatever it may be, but that the rioting that is taking place, obviously in my opinion, it is like how long will people wait, right? Like if they are faced with armed police officers, like like we've seen, how long are they, like what are they supposed to do? What are the other, they've tried every single route other than that, that this almost seems like the last resort. We've had enough. We're putting our foot down kind of situation,
Yeah. 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 I hear you. I think this is right. I guess I would say, and maybe this is, well, I don't know how this will go over, but
It's okay. Open for
I'm not
conversation.
sure. I'm actually not convinced that the looters,
Mm-hmm.
that the people who are, that the looters are not part of the protest.
Right.
That in this sense,
Mm-hmm.
I think when, if you look at poverty, for example, urban poverty in Black communities, it's hard to make any kind of compelling case that poverty is unrelated to the institutional
The
system and
system.
systemic
Yeah.
conditions of racism and white supremacy, right?
100%. Yep.
If you, I'm not surprised that part of the rage that people would feel is against capitalism.
Yeah, of
Is
course.
against private property, is against the overpricing of goods in poor communities, particularly necessary goods like foods, for example, and feminine hygiene products, right?
Right.
The,
And it
over
all
marketing of alcohol.
right.
Like, I think that looting, in some sense,
Mm-hmm.
might be part of the uprising.
Right. And it almost seems like it was the only way the system cared about the situation is when property was, being vandalized or damaged, and like when their system was being affected, for example, of capitalism, which kind of signals that the value of life, like value of George Floyd's life, for example, was held at a lower cost than the vandalism, or the impact that it had on the stores or capitalism in general.
Yeah, I agree.
So yeah, for me, like that was always kind of on my mind, because even in Canada we're having lots of protests, and all of this amidst a pandemic as well, right? Like 2 weeks ago, people have realized now, and initially some people were angry about, like, why are people protesting amidst a pandemic? We're supposed to stay home, need social distancing.
Yeah.
While I do understand the health implications of it that would have on the system, and but I think this, like I said, is kind of like a last resort. What else do you expect people to do in a situation like this? They've had enough of it. This issue right now, to us, it seems like it's more important, right, for this to be right at this moment, right? We're in a very important moment in time, I think, where, like, we're all witnessing something big happening, right? Something that has, people are saying no more, we're going to move on
Yeah.
with this, and then we're going to try to, like, reform these changes, and I don't know what the outcomes are going to be. One of the main things that that has occurred from this situation is that the police officers did get arrested, right? All four of them. So obviously, collective dissent has, and throughout history we've seen this. If people don't say anything to the system, and if they comply, it will just keep moving on the direction that it has been moving on, and then you have more disparities over time rather than change. So I think people that are currently open to conversation, people that are currently adding to the movement, it's like everyone's fight back, or everyone's retaliation against the injustices.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Gosh, there's a lot in there.
We have
to,
all the
to
time in the
speak
world.
back to. One of the things I think is that when people go to a demonstration in the midst of a pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the message is, this is so important, so critical to the quality
Right,
of our
right,
lives,
right,
that we
right.
will put our lives on the
On the
line,
line, exactly.
right? And it does seem important to me not to judge people who are immune compromised, for example, who are particularly at risk in the, of the virus not going to demonstrations.
Right.
But I don't think you get to tell people that they are unethical in some way for putting their lives on the line to speak out against racism and racist violence, right? The thing about the officers being charged, yes, they have been charged. Now all of them have been charged. And the charge against he who shall not be named.
Don't even name him, yeah. I was about to say that.
has been raised from 3rd degree murder, which, like, I don't know even what that is, to
Right.
2nd degree murder.
Right.
But of course, we've been here before too. We were here when Rodney King was brutally beaten by the Los Angeles police. And those officers were acquitted. We have yet to see a conviction. And so, yes, I think it's progress that all of the officers have been charged, that George Floyd's death has been named murder in the indictment. But we should wait to see what happens, and we should certainly hold the criminal justice system, the legal system, to account.
100%. I agree with that. Right.
They have a right to a trial. They have a right to the presumption of innocence. But that presumption of innocence for white people and for police officers has extended in really evil ways.
In their protection.
Right, for murdering people of color.
Right. And, that's something that I think moving forward that needs to change as well. Like the way we're, a lot of the rhetoric now around social media is defunding the police, and which is something that I do agree with, because why are we spending so much of our, like I was thinking, a friend of mine brought this up to me the other day. He was saying, like, why, like a community police officer, for example, why are they militarized? They're supposed to be here for, like, to serve and protect. And he was saying, like, how about, instead of having real guns, we have, like, if the cause is to protect yourself, right? And that's why you need a gun, to protect yourself. Then, like the rubber bullets that they're using right now, I feel like that's, that should be enough to, like, defend people in most cases of these, the most scenarios that a police officer may face in a community, right? Where, because their job is not to murder, their job is to, if anything, to detain people that are not abiding by the law, right? And bring them to the justice system, rather than them being the judge and deciding the fate of these people, and just brutally getting away with murder, right? In a lot of these cases. So there clearly needs to be a conversation, and people are, I'm really loving the energy of, like, people just signing petitions and, like, reaching out to their police departments, saying, like, how is my taxpayer money being broken down? How is this money being spent? And another thing that needs to be in the conversation as well is, like, how are we training these people? We're clearly training them with certain biases, and it is, like, it's very difficult for a person to have that kind of a power and not be corrupted by it. You know what I mean? Like
I do.
So, like we mentioned before in the podcast, that, no, they're not in the state to police themselves, right? So it just leads to absolute corruption, and we see this happen, in Canada and America, everywhere, basically, where this kind of a system exists. So maybe it's time for reform for these systems to, like, take a step back and look at what's actually happening, because unless we attack that part of the conversation and that part of the system, I don't think any productive change can happen. Like you said, things will just blow over. We'll feel like we've won, and then it will repeat itself again.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of moving parts, right? So there's there's a really wonderful writer named Jeffrey Riemann, who wrote a book called The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison.
Oh,
I think it came out in the 1990s. And Riemann's argument is that, in part at least, that there are racial and class disparities in even what's defined as a crime,
Right. Yeah.
as well as what's pursued through the criminal justice system. And the crimes that white collar crimes, for example, are far less likely to be pursued through the criminal justice system to the point of conviction.
Right.
Yep. They're not punished with the same kind of severity that other kinds of crimes
There's
are.
Clear biases against like class divisions of
right.
crimes.
So there's that piece to work on. I think that defunding the police, like you, I think that would be a really important move to make, but necessary but insufficient unless the money that is gained from defunding the police is put into community programs, including education and healthcare and cultural development and opportunity, and so not just putting it somewhere else, putting it back in the community in ways that are productive and healthy and caring, rather than repressive, is another piece of that problem. And then, or another piece of what needs to be done. And then another thing that I think bears saying is that because of the brutality of police violence, because of the particular brutality of the murder of George Floyd, I worry that we may slide back into that sense that racism looks like that.
Right.
But racism looks like what I do when I'm driving through the Jane and Finch corridor in Toronto, and I carefully reach over and check to make sure my car doors are locked, right?
Right, yeah.
Or I hold my purse more tightly in the elevator. Right? When a person of color comes on board. Racism doesn't look like that. It looks like what those terrible police officers do.
I think it's in like it's varied at different levels, right? Like these microaggressions, if you will, that we partake in. A lot of it could be just unknowingly you're just doing that. But if you're not able to acknowledge that, then that's where the issue lies, because that grows into a bigger dragon that over time, because that little act, if you just like, for example, clutching your purse, for example, right, and then you kind of translate that onwards, and subconsciously it's like a seed that's just growing in your head over and over again. Right. And then unless and until you acknowledge that at that individual level, I think because that's what ends up happening. Like people are kind of like, we talked about this before, like they have this perception of who they are, and like, I'm not a racist, I don't publicly whatever, but at the end of the day, what happens in your own head, like, are you able to kind of mediate that? Are you able to understand your own actions and behaviors to the point where you allow yourself to change, to the point where you allow yourself to be educated?
Right. And I think we have to be able to think more complexly, right?
Right.
So it's not sufficient to only work on oneself, right? It's not sufficient to only work on those eruptions of racism that are external to oneself, right? All at once, all the time. And these things are interrelated, right? It's a wicked, we have created in white supremacy and racism an extraordinarily wicked problem.
Tangled problem, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so we won't be untangling it or dismantling its complexity quickly, nor will we be untangling it or dismantling it if we're only ever pulling on only one thread at a time.
Right. So it's just being conscious of the entire picture,
right,
and moving forward with that. I think, that's actually really great advice. And Dr. C, I just want to say that throughout this conversation, like I've obviously learned a lot, and I'm coming from a place where I was, you know, conflicted, I guess, in the sense that, like I said, I felt this powerlessness, and then I felt like, I needed to have a conversation where we can kind of touch upon these issues. And a lot of my friends, they would really appreciate this conversation as well. So I really want to thank you for coming on the show and talking about it with me, talking it through with me. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You know what I think? You should bring some of your friends onto the podcast to have that conversation
Oh,
that
I
you were
have, yeah, yeah.
describing to me.
I
I mean, I just think that's such important work that you're doing, and it's operating at all these different levels. And I'm just so glad and grateful that you're here and that you are doing what you're doing.
Thank you. No, I think part of it had to do with the discussions that we did have in class, and it kind of resonated with me throughout. Like what am I adding to it? What am I adding to the entire conversation? Am I staying silent? Am I not using my privilege, if you will? Because I'm given this I mean, at least I have this platform now that I can use to reach
Yeah,
out to people. And my vision with this podcast is that, if anything, from my experiences and like from the conversations that I have with other people, you know that someone somewhere can learn something and then take that with them and then move forward and pay it forward as well, right?
right.
And before we conclude everything, I just want to ask you, what are some things that people like me, what are some things that we can do, people like, what are some things people can do in order to like face situations like this, throughout our lives, and moving forward as well?
Of course, you want to end with the big question. We could have a whole other hour and a half
It's
conversation, right?
it's a very hopeful question.
um, well, I think, of course, some of these things you're already doing, right? You're gathering to you people with whom you have deep affiliative relationships in order to talk together and learn together and grow together in your commitment to racial justice, right?
Hmm.
That's not a small contribution. It's a big contribution, right?
Right.
Another thing that you're doing, I think that's really important, is taking that conversation public. So beyond that circle, that close circle of people with whom you're deeply affiliated, right? To
Hmm.
people who you have never met before, may never ever meet, right?
Right.
And inviting them to the conversation as well. I think it's really important for people to show up to the demonstrations if they can, um, if they're not vulnerable to COVID, to go and put their lives on the line. Uh, I think it's incumbent on those of us uh, who are not uh, Black Canadians
Hmm.
to listen, to believe, um, to support, to amplify, um, if we need to stand between the police
Right. Right.
and those demonstrators, to put our professional lives on the line by speaking out against racism that we encounter in the places where we work, right? Uh, we need all of us, I think, to be brave,
Hmm.
to be bold, to be vulnerable, and to act with humility,
Right.
right?
Right.
Every day. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, because I think this is a timely conversation. A lot of people are feeling uh different emotions, in this time. And given the circumstances of the pandemic, plus you know the situation with the protests, I think for a lot of it, at least for me, it was very overwhelming mentally. It was taking a huge toll on it. So like, to be able to hash these things out and to be able to have open conversation so that it's productive and we can move forward. It is very important. So I would like to thank you for that. And I also want to thank you for being the first academic on the show. This is episode 4.
Thank you so much. Yay.
Hopefully I'll be having some more professors on as well, but different issues. I think I have something lined up soon. People should listen to. And is there any place that people can visit to like read your work or to kind of know more about you?
Well, go to Amazon or Chapters or Powell Books and put my name in, and books will come up. But also, I am a member of a new collective called the Aptly Outspoken Collective. We're doing starting a series of webinars, the first one of which is tomorrow night at 7:00. And Dr. Christopher Taylor from the University of Waterloo will be our guest. And we'll be talking about body acknowledgements. So Google Aptly Outspoken. I don't have the URL memorized yet.
I could probably find it. I'll edit it.
So, check out Aptly Outspoken, the collective, and join us for the webinars.
Well, thank you so much. I'll just end this conversation here and I'll speak to you off the air.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.